Your average history fan will be able to tell you the history of Japan until World War II. It began with the Sengoku or Warring States period, where Japan was internally divided into many smaller states for about 150 years, until finally Oda Nobunaga managed to reunify most of the island. Upon his death, his successor, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, completely unified the islands. And his successor then, Tokugawa Ieyasu, would start the Edo period, where Japan isolated itself, restricting trade and contact with the outside world for 250 years. Only when America rocked up with gunboats was Japan forced to reopen, starting a period of rapid modernization, eventually ending with World War II. But there is one major event that is left out in this general history of Japan: the Imjin Wars. After Toyotomi Hideyoshi successfully unified Japan, he decided that he had bigger plans. The center of the world as Japan knew it had always been the giant China. Even the names we use to refer to the island, Nippon, Nihon or Japan, all refer to the Sunrise Kingdom, because the sun rises in the east and from China's perspective, that's where Japan was. So Hideyoshi, not content with merely ruling the Sunrise Kingdom, set his sights west. There is still debate as to whether Hideyoshi was actually expecting to conquer China, or if his goals were more limited to things like Korea, Ryukyu and Taiwan. My personal idea is that Hideyoshi, to some extent, was a megalomaniac. If he had the chance to conquer China, or even keep going from there, he would have. But Hideyoshi's motivations are very clear. He was the first person to fully unify Japan after centuries of division, but with that came a clear issue. What was his legitimacy to rule, apart from having a large army? He was born a peasant, he had no grand, noble background to refer back to, and conquering China would make him the most powerful man in the world and give him tons of prestige. But even just conquering Korea would mean that he was the man that unified Japan and managed to invade mainland Asia, expanding Japan and humiliating the Chinese. Additionally, 150 years of constant conflict breeds a very large warrior class in society. Having hundreds of thousands of samurai simply sitting around is a recipe for disaster. If another warlord could convince just a large chunk of them that he would be a better ruler than Hideyoshi, then there was a chance of Hideyoshi being overthrown. Getting this large warrior class behind him in an invasion of Korea would give Hideyoshi legitimacy, satisfy his personal ambitions, and keep this warrior class busy. So, in 1592, Hideyoshi launches his invasion of Korea. Within a year, he managed to capture all the way to northern Korea, capturing as far as Pyongyang. But Korean naval harassment made supply and reinforcement difficult, forcing the Japanese back. By 1594, Hideyoshi fully retreats from Korea. But not to be deterred, Hideyoshi prepares again, and in 1597, the Japanese strike back, capturing the south, but again, experiencing difficulty with logistics and getting stuck. Eventually, having to fall back and, upon the death of Hideyoshi, fully retreat, ending Japanese ambitions upon Korea, at least for now. The main Korean asset was Admiral Yi Sun-sin, who managed to use the Korean Navy in an extremely effective harassment campaign against the Japanese, thus ruining Japanese supply and massively reducing Japanese combat effectiveness. So today, we are discussing a world in which Hideyoshi succeeds in the Imjin Wars. But, like mentioned before, this causes an issue. What does winning the Imjin War mean? Conquering Korea? Conquering China? Conquering parts of either? It's a bit unclear. To keep realism to a maximum, we will assume that, whatever Hideyoshi's personal ambitions may be, Hideyoshi decides, or is advised to, focus on the conquest of Korea and stop there for now, seeking to repair relations with China afterwards rather than attempt to conquer it. Why? Because conquering Korea from under the protection of the Ming is already ambitious enough. Having Hideyoshi conquer all of China would be much more unrealistic. So, how do we make this victory happen? If we look at how the initial stages of the war progress in our timeline, allowing the Japanese to have a more complete military victory here is not too difficult to imagine. By no means was Hideyoshi's invasion going perfectly, but the Japanese clearly had the upper hand. Had the war been just between Korea and Japan, Japan surely would have been able to eventually grind down the Koreans. So there are two major changes we will make to facilitate the Japanese victory and keep realism intact. The Chinese are even slower to respond to the problems in Korea, giving the Japanese more time to consolidate their victories and defensive positions over Korea before the Chinese do intervene in significant force. The second change we will make is removing Admiral Yi from history. We will simply have him replaced with some pencil-pushing admiral who is unable to achieve massive victories against the numerically superior Japanese. This means that, apart from minor interference, the Japanese have complete access to the sea. Another minor change we'll make is to have the initial Japanese invasion be even more devastating upon the Koreans, allowing all of the south to fall, freeing most Japanese soldiers up for the eventual fight with the Chinese in the north. The Chinese eventually do intervene and link up with the Koreans, but their initial counterattacks are rebuffed. This allows the Japanese to start solidifying defensive lines. To satisfy Hideyoshi's curiosity and ambition, we will have him send some probing attacks into China to see if a full conquest is possible, but these get rebuffed, making Hideyoshi realize that maybe Korea is ambitious enough. At this point, the war grinds to a halt. The Chinese fail to dislodge the Japanese, and the Japanese fail to invade China. Both sides would really like to continue the war until a full victory, but eventually they sit down for a peace deal. Japan now owns most or all of Korea, but that doesn't mean that the Japanese are now in a good situation, even if peace is signed with the Ming. There is a fourth player in East Asia, the Jurchen tribes, who even offered their assistance to the Ming during the war and were unhappy about the Japanese incursions up to their border. Japan would, in the future, have to contend with both the Jurchen and the Ming, who dislike Japanese control over Korea. But even internally, Japanese control over Korea will face many difficulties over the following decades. First, we have the Koreans themselves. While the ordinary Korean will not notice or care too much whether they are being ruled by the Japanese or Korean elites, it's feudal times after all, the Korean elites and bureaucrats have built up a strong Korean identity, linked in large parts to Korea's status as China's younger brother. The Japanese would either have to remove all Korean bureaucrats, which cannot happen in the short term, or the Japanese will have many people with questionable loyalties in their Korean administration. Then there is the obvious issue of the constant northern threat. The Ming would want to invade and restore their honor by re-establishing Korea, while the growing power of the Jurchen would seek to expand their influence and are distrustful of the Japanese. The Japanese would need to be constantly vigilant, balancing their diplomacy with both states, while keeping up their military strength at the border at all times. If Japan ever falters in their defenses, they will surely be overrun by their opponents. Both of these are incredibly important to keep in mind when discussing the next part, and the thing that I consider the death nail to realistic continued Japanese control over Korea. The death of Hideyoshi. Around 1598, Hideyoshi would die, leaving his 5-year-old son, Hideyori, as his heir. Obviously, the other powerful Japanese warlords weren't going to let a 5-year-old rule Japan, and after a brief power struggle, Tokugawa Ieyasu would secure control over Japan, resulting in the Edo period and Japanese isolationism in our own timeline. And even this small window of internal power struggle in Japan could be a make or break for Japanese control over Korea, and if it were my guess, it would be break. It was only a couple of years after Hideyoshi would have conquered Korea, and for the previously mentioned reasons, Japanese control would be far from stable. This alternate timeline struggle for power would likely be much more costly, as the victory in Korea strengthened Toyotomi loyalists, and if any form of civil war were to break out between two or more factions, Japanese control over Korea would be severely in danger. Whatever side the Korean daimyo are loyal to, they have a choice to make. Stand guard in Korea and stay out of the struggle for power, or risk an invasion of Korea by leaving their positions to make a difference on the Japanese islands themselves. The specifics of any struggle for power is impossible to tell, as the conquest of Korea has put different daimyo in different positions of power, but Ieyasu will still be a powerful warlord on the Japanese islands, while even warlords loyal to Hideyoshi would want to be the one that puppet masters the young Hideyori. In my opinion, there is little doubt in my mind that this period of chaos in Japan would result in the weakening of the Japanese positions in Korea to such an extent that either the Ming, the Jurchen, or both will overrun Korea, or at least break through the initial northern lines, weakening the Japanese defensive potential in the future. If we don't change anything else apart from Hideyoshi's conquest of Korea happens, I have very little hope for the Japanese occupation of Korea to last long. So, for the sake of this scenario, we will have Hideyoshi survive about a decade longer. Assuming reality keeps his ambitions in check, and he doesn't use this extra time to prepare and attempt another questionable invasion of China, he can use this time to finally solidify his rule. Because Hideyoshi's rule has been extremely fast-paced. He was a peasant by birth and rose the ranks as a foot soldier under various lords until finally becoming part of Nobunaga's army. He quickly earned Nobunaga's favor and later became one of his top generals, and a couple of years later was awarded land, making him an official daimyo. He continued to serve Nobunaga's effort to unify Japan until Nobunaga's death in 1582. Afterwards, Hideyoshi took Nobunaga's place and spent the next decade unifying the rest of Japan. When this was done, he immediately set his sights west, and he died towards the end of his efforts to conquer Korea. There isn't much time here for Hideyoshi to just take a breather and start reforming and consolidating his control over Japan. This extra decade we grant Hideyoshi can be spent to secure succession for his son, slowly weaken the power of the daimyo, and solidifying Japanese control over Korea. Loyal daimyos are strengthened with new lands in Korea, while slowly but steadily the Korean administrators are being replaced with Japanese ones. Defensive and fallback lines would be constructed in northern Korea, strengthening the Japanese defense in case of a northern attack. Meanwhile, the successful conquest of Korea made Hideyoshi, and therefore his Toyotomi clan, have much more legitimacy to rule, improving Hideyori's position when he does finally come to power. Finally, when Hideyoshi does die, his son, Hideyori, is now a 15-year-old boy, inheriting a much stronger position of power, still too young to suddenly have to manage a delicate position of power, but a lot better than coming to power at the age of 5. But by no means will the following decades be easy for young Hideyori. The most obvious threat to his reign are still the other daimyo. Despite a general acceptance of Hideyoshi and now Hideyori as the first among the daimyo, by no means did their Toyotomi clan control even close to a majority of land under Japan's control. If ever the loyalty of a critical mass of daimyo came into question, a new struggle for power could erupt to remove Hideyori from power, or even leave Japan in a new period of disunity. While Hideyori's legitimacy and position would be much greater in this alternate timeline, that doesn't mean that the ambition of the other daimyo has suddenly been removed, and Hideyori still holds the position that every daimyo aspires to. Then of course, Hideyori also has to solve the issue of Korea. The constant need for defenses in Korea would be very costly for Hideyori, weakening his position on the Japanese mainland. Essentially, the conquest of Korea has left Japan exposed. Instead of an island nation with no great natural enemies, Japan has now turned itself into a constant thorn in the side of arguably the strongest nation on earth. Then finally, Hideyori also has to solve the issue of the Europeans. Europeans were trading with Japan, spreading new technologies, ideas, and a new religion. Ieyasu solved this by strict isolation, cutting Japan off from the rest of the world. This would be much more difficult and dangerous in this alternate timeline, as at least attempting to restore relations with the Chinese emperor would be a wise move, but assuming that the Chinese don't want to restore relations, finding other friends among the Europeans would be a smart idea to deter renewed conflict with the Chinese. Hideyori, in this alternate timeline, doesn't have the luxury of isolation, since it would give all the diplomatic initiative to their continental opponents. This means that the alternate Japan will also need to deal with the spread of European ideas and religions spreading into their nation. From here, the future of the timeline gets muddy to predict, so I will go with two different routes. The first one assumes that Hideyoshi's reforms were successful and Hideyori manages to complete or continue them, taming the threat of the daimyo and securing his rule in Korea. The second scenario assumes that Hideyori doesn't. So let's start with the timeline where Hideyoshi and Hideyori are successful. The system of daimyo control over land is not abolished. That would be a reform too radical to force through. But the daimyo are increasingly weakened. This can be done in many ways. Increasing Toyotomi controlled lands, more central oversight, removing automatic father-to-son land inheritance, giving daimyos smaller or disconnected pieces of land, making forming a coalition against the Toyotomi much more difficult, etc. The exact methods that Hideyoshi and Hideyori choose are impossible to say, but weakening the daimyo is key to securing the rulership of Japan. With these reforms in place, Hideyoshi's Toyotomi clan will be able to continue to rule Japan into the foreseeable future. Then the administration of Korea, which is also done through daimyo, would slowly be reformed as well. While the highest positions in Korea would have been taken over by the Japanese immediately, key aspects of Korean administration is still done by Koreans. This Korean presence over administration roles would slowly but steadily be eroded over the next couple of decades, until eventually it's Japanese who rule, administer and tax their Korean subjects. If we're assuming that Japan manages to hold on to Korea for centuries, it is very possible that slowly but steadily the Japanese language infiltrates the Korean peninsula, starting slowly with the Korean upper and middle classes, but then spreading down to the Korean lower classes as well. Obviously, not all Koreans would suddenly switch to becoming Japanese, but the longer the Japanese rule over the peninsula lasts, the weaker Korea's culture gets. It is very well possible that if Japan holds on to Korea for a couple of centuries, Japanese control over the peninsula would become so normalized that Korea is increasingly integrated as a part of Japan proper. Now, how Hideyori and the Toyotomi clan would treat the Europeans is difficult to say. They would likely not be open to Christianity, forbidding the spread of the religion, but they do have much to gain from ensuring trade routes and close relationships to the Europeans. Even if Japan manages to ensure good relations with the current emperor of China, the next emperor could suddenly decide that retaking Korea from Japan will be his crowning achievement. Turning to isolationism while holding Korea would be like sticking your head in the sand, simply hoping that the Chinese don't attempt to reclaim Korea. No. Instead, Japan would need to be constantly vigilant, not necessarily keeping up with all European advances, but if you're going to be ready for war with the Chinese, you're going to at least keep up to date with military advances. It's possible that Japan gets some new expansionist ideas, but the window for this is very small. Soon, the relatively weak Ming would be overthrown by the much stronger king, removing any easy opportunity for Japanese control over China. Then to the south are the Philippines, which are already claimed by the Spanish, and to the north is land that is currently unowned, but even that is soon to be claimed by the ever-expanding Russians. While a war with Russia would probably be winnable, transport technology wasn't quite good enough for Russia's army to easily travel the distance of an entire continent, war with Spain or the Qing is not. Between 1600 and 1800, apart from the northern islands and maybe Taiwan, there are simply no more lands to realistically conquer. So here I will end the successful Hideyori scenario. We now have a new Japan, not isolated but instead very well connected, attempting to build good relations with both Europe and the Qing. They haven't adopted all European technologies, but their armies are first in East Asia. From here, it's impossible to predict any further. As Europe starts its age of industrialization, does this alternate Japan fully join in, or is this the point where Japan starts to lag behind the extremely fast-paced changes that industrialization brings, much like China in our own timeline? I will leave that up to you all in the comments. Turning back time, let's look at the second possibility that Hideyori fails to control the daimyo system. This would inevitably lead to the collapse of Japan's little empire. Especially Tokugawa Ieyasu, one of the most powerful daimyo and the shogun of our own timeline, can be a major destabilizer. If the daimyo system isn't to some significant extent curtailed, then it's a matter of time before civil conflict once again rocks Japan, as ambitions start to clash and new potential shoguns present themselves. And, like I've said 1,000 times at this point, if Japan cannot keep itself united, it cannot keep Korea under control either. Maybe the Ming would restore an independent Korea, maybe the Jurchen integrate parts of Korea into their control, before marching on Beijing to form the Qing dynasty. The renewed struggle for power within Japan would also mean that relations with Europeans would suffer, since the benefit of angering China by supporting Japan would be very little in this alternate timeline. If leadership is constantly changing hands in Japan, long-term relations cannot be built either. This new period of disunity in Japan means that Japan is not seen as a trading or even a military power in East Asia. Instead, the Europeans would continue to play the different factions off against each other, attempting to spread Christianity by supporting warlords who converted to the religion and building trading spheres within the nation. Even if Korea doesn't immediately fall, this alternate Japan, with hungry eyes from the Qing and the Europeans, would probably not fare well in the 17th century. Whenever the opportunity presents itself, the Qing would invade and restore the Koreans, both to create a new tributary in Korea, as well as to increase the legitimacy of the emperor by proving that he can right the wrongs of his predecessors. With Korea lost, there is little point in continuing this scenario much further. We have no idea who rules Japan, what Japan's relation to the rest of the world is, how strong the daimyo still are, or if a new unifier of Japan would rise, etc. But one thing is for certain. If Hideyoshi would have managed to conquer Korea in the Imjin Wars, this would have been a massive spit in the face of any reigning Chinese dynasty. If Japan was to hold onto Korea into the future, it would need to ensure internal control by subduing the daimyo and the Koreans, while ensuring that they have modern armies and friends abroad. Or it would simply be a matter of time before Korea is once again lost. Whether or not Toyotomi Hideyoshi and Hideyori would have been able to build this unified Japan from which to hold on to Korea, I will leave up to you in the comments. For now, I will end this scenario here. If you enjoyed the content, consider subscribing for at least one more alternate history video every single week. To help the video grow, consider leaving a like and a comment. It really helps out against the algorithm. Even just commenting something simple like hi helps the video out massively. Again, thank you all for watching, and a special thanks to these patrons who help me dedicate more time and effort to the channel by supporting me monetarily. To help the channel and get early access to videos whenever I complete them myself, consider supporting me there. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next week. Goodbye.